Hey everyone, today we are going to be talking about opposites and absolute value. So that's some new vocabulary for us. Opposites, like what are opposites? We talked a little bit about that in terms of like up, down, left, right, and so on. And then we're going to talk about absolute value, which is going to be pretty new to most of us. So opposites are numbers that are the same distance from zero in opposite directions. And we know that based on our number lines. So we've been drawing number lines lately, and we've been talking about how zero is the great divide. So here's my zero, and that numbers on either side of zero should be symmetrical. So -2 and positive 2 are opposites, -1 and 1 are opposites, and so on. Making sure that we're counting up away from zero in both directions, even though the negative numbers are technically getting smaller. Now, absolute value is the distance between a number and zero on a number line. So, for example, up on my number line up here, excuse me, this is 2 units away from zero. This is also 2 units away from zero because distance cannot be negative. So when I'm counting a number's distance from zero, I have to count that in positive units. The way we notate that is we use these nice long absolute value bars, and the value that we want to find the absolute value of goes in between those bars. So the distance from -2 to 0 is going to be 2 units. So the absolute value of -2 is 2. And if I do the same thing for the positive number, so the absolute value of +2, that number is also 2 units away from 0, so the absolute value of +2 is 2. It's all about distance from 0 when it comes to absolute value. So you're counting the number of units away from 0 that these numbers are. And when I put a negative value into the absolute value symbols or the absolute value bars, that value is going to come out positive because a number's distance from 0 cannot be negative. Now, in the start of our examples here, we're going to talk about opposites mainly. So this says, finding opposites. The opposite of -5 is written blank. So when you guys see the word opposite, I want you to think of the word opposite as a negative symbol. Because when I say the opposite of +5, that's -5. I'm adding a negative symbol to my number. So anytime you see the word opposite, I want you to think of that as adding another negative sign. So the opposite of -5 is going to be written the opposite of -5. And again, the word opposite means negative. So the opposite of 7 is going to be the opposite of 7. Now, when I say the opposite of a negative number, the opposite of a negative number is going to come out positive. The opposite of -5 is +5. The opposite of +7 is -7. So now we're going to evaluate a bunch of these opposite questions. And again, when I'm given the information in words, I'm going to think of the word opposite as another negative symbol, and I'm going to write my symbolic expression, so the expression involving the symbols, the math symbols, by adding those negative signs. So this says find the opposite of -5. So the opposite of -5, which we just did up here, is +5. And then again, the opposite of 7, so the opposite of +7 is going to be -7. This one, this is the opposite of -15. The opposite of -15 is +15. The opposite of 0, remember that 0 is not positive or negative, so 0 just stays 0. Okay, we don't have to add a negative sign to the front of 0 because 0 is not negative or positive, it's the middle. Again, this is the word opposite right here. So the opposite of -10 is +10. And the opposite of 12 is -12. Now in this next part, it says finding opposites of opposites. So there's going to be two of these words here. Find the opposite of positive 2. So we're going to have more than one negative symbol when it comes to our symbolic expression or the expression involving math symbols. So I'm going to say the opposite of 2. And then you evaluate from the inside out. So the opposite of positive 2 is negative 2. The opposite of negative 2, so that's the entire expression, is going to be positive 2. And you can think of it in terms of the number of negative symbols that you have determines what your answer comes out as. So here I can see I have an even number of negatives and my answer came out positive. So now let's look at the next one. It says the opposite of negative 7. So the opposite of negative 7. And when I look at it from the inside out, the opposite of negative 7 is a positive, and then the opposite of that positive is going to be back to a negative. There's 3 negative signs, and my answer came out negative. So when I have an even number of negatives, my answer is going to come out positive. When I have an odd number of negative signs, my answer is going to come out negative. So now we're just going to practice writing these expressions and evaluating them. So the opposite of 10 is going to be the opposite of 10. And this is going to come out as a positive 10. An even number of negatives gives me a positive. Opposite of negative 8. So opposite of negative 8. So the opposite of a negative is a positive. The opposite of a positive is back to a negative. Down here, I can see these 3 negatives. So again, the opposite of a negative is a positive, and the opposite of that positive is back to negative 75. And the opposite of positive 42 is going to stay a positive. So again, those 2 negative symbols are going to become a positive, so my value stays positive. Understanding these 2 things is going to come in handy when we start evaluating expressions with positive and negative integers. So being able to evaluate expressions where 2 negatives are right next to each other is going to be very important coming up here shortly. In this next example, we're going to talk about absolute value. So I talked about it at the very beginning. Absolute value is a number's distance from 0 on the number line. So when I talk about the absolute value of negative 4, how far is negative 4 away from 0? It is 4 units away from 0. And distance cannot be negative. The absolute value of positive 8. 8 is 8 units away from 0. So 8. And the absolute value of 0, how far away from 0 am I? I am 0 units away from 0. Now there is one special case where your answer will remain a negative. So I'm going to add that like right here. I'm going to say like this is a special example. And I'm going to say the opposite of the absolute value of 6. Let's just do that. Now in this one, I would evaluate this absolute value first. 6 is 6 units away from 0. But I have this opposite out front. So this answer does come out as a negative. Because the opposite of that absolute value is negative. And it works the same way when you have a negative inside the absolute value. So if I have the opposite of the absolute value of negative 3, I need to evaluate this absolute value first. The absolute value, the distance that negative 3 is from 0 is positive, but then I have to have this negative come back in. So the opposite of that absolute value is going to remain a negative. So these are special cases. We have to pay attention to what the negative is, where the negative is, not what it is, where the negative is in terms of the absolute value. Is the negative on the inside of the absolute value bars being evaluated as part of absolute value, or is it on the outside representing an opposite? Okay. Now we're going to look at some application questions of absolute value and being able to find distance between things and understanding how that distance works. So this says a seagull is flying 25 feet above sea level. So I'm going to draw, here's some water. So here is my seagull flying 25 feet above sea level. Tony is diving 15 feet below sea level. So here's Tony. And he is 15 feet below sea level. And I want to know the distance between Tony and the seagull. So what is the distance between Tony and the seagull? So technically, Tony is at negative 15 feet. But when I'm talking about distance, distance cannot be negative. I want to know this entire distance. I'm going to do 25 plus 15, and I'm going to get 40 feet. So these two things are 40 feet apart. Tony and the bird are 40 feet apart. Number 15 says Anna has negative 10 points in a video game and her friend has 12 points in the same video game. What is the difference between the two scores? In this one, I'm going to use a number line to help me solve the problem. So here is 0 points, and I know that Anna is over here at negative 10. And I've got friend at 12. So Anna is 10 points from 0, and friend is 12 points from 0. So 10 plus 12 is 22 points difference. I can combine those distances together because I need to know how far apart they are. Number 16 says Jalen is swimming at 20 feet below sea level and swims up to a fish that is 8 feet below sea level. So everything is happening underwater here. So here is my water. Here's Jalen. And she's at 20 feet below. So I can say she's at negative 20 feet. And then here's my fishy. And this fishy is 8 feet below sea level, so that's at negative 8. And Jalen is swimming up to this fish. And I want to know how far did she swim? Well, again, when I'm talking about distance, distance cannot be negative. So she's 20 feet below sea level. And I'm swimming up to this. So I'm actually going to subtract 8 feet because I'm on the same side of 0. Both of these values started in the negative, but distance can't be negative. And I'm trying to get from one to the other on the same side of 0. So I'm just counting the number of feet in between them. So 20 minus 8 is going to be 12 feet. Number 17 says Lucy dropped a coin in a wishing well. The top of the well can be represented by 0 feet. And the location of the coin can be represented by 32 feet. So here is the top of the well. And here is the bottom. And the coin went down. So here's my coin. Negative 32 feet. So the coin fell 32 feet. Because again, when we're talking about distance and measuring something in distance, that distance cannot be negative. So even though the position of the coin is at negative 32 feet, when we're talking about the distance, that distance has to be positive. So this is integers, using integers to evaluate opposites and absolute value. And then now you're going to practice.